Hello, Little Woman fans. Today's comment shoutout goes to Azul, who left this comment to my article, Why Joe and Laurie Don't End Up Together. Quote, as a person who has only seen the 2019 movie and the 2017 series, I am very grateful for this article. I really liked the story in Little Woman, but I always wondered why Joe wasn't in love with Laurie, especially since they seemed to get along pretty well. Now, I see that everything makes sense thanks to your enlightenment regarding the missing details found in the original source. I am very surprised that why they left many of Laurie's traits out of the films. Thank you for this piece, very deep, informative and well written. Thank you, Azul. Laurie is one of the most complicated characters in Little Woman, and it is sad that so many of the things that are part of his personality have been erased by the filmmakers, because not only does these characteristics of him explain why Jo rejects him and why she falls in love with Friedrich, but also why he falls in love with Amy and she to him. When people study Louisa May Alcott's life, were they then hobbyists or schoolers, people choose an area that they are interested, and one of the areas that I study is the literature that Louisa May Alcott liked to read, and how these certain storylines from these books can be found from Little Woman. And when I started that research, I quite soon came to the conclusion that Louisa May Alcott planned both Jo's and Friedrich's marriage and Amy's and Laurie's marriage years before she wrote Little Woman. They all can be found from the books that she read as a young person. For example, Jo and Friedrich type of relationship can be found from Susan Warner's book White White World, and that book appeared when Louisa was about 18 years old, and if we believe her journals, around that time she fell in love to her friend Henry David Thoreau, and in Susan Warner's book there's a spirited young woman who falls in love to her older male friend who also happens to be a philosopher. When people complain that Little Woman is sentimental, I recommend to read White White World. It is 100 times more sentimental than Little Woman, and it was one of the things that I struggled when I was reading it. Another Jo and Friedrich story would be the story of Eliza and Charles Follen, and that was a book that Louisa read at the age of 12. The real-life story of an American female writer who falls in love to a German immigrant. The connection there is so obvious, no one can argue with that. But then there are also the Laurie and Amy stories. A Laurie story can be traced to Louisa's favorite book, Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. Wilhelm is very similar character to Laurie. He wants to run away and become an actor, but his father wants him to take on the family business. And then in Little Woman, Laurie wants to run away and become a musician, like his mother, but his grandfather wants him to take on the family business. Wilhelm starts out having an affair with Mariana and then moves on to Natalia. And there's a scene in Wilhelm Meister where Natalia and Wilhelm are in the garden and he confesses his love to her. And the teenage Louisa May Alcott has spent their word beautiful. So when people say that, oh, Alcott didn't want to marry Jo to Laurie, so she just married him to Amy and Friedrich to Jo in the last minute, I digress. I think the only way that Jo would have ended up with Laurie is if Louisa May Alcott would have married Laddie Wisniewski, and that never happened. She considered it, but rightfully turned him down. Then Friedrich is based on her first love, Henry, partially. One of the themes in Wilhelm Meister is the idea that the male character grows as an individual when he moves on from Mariana to Natalia, because the next relationship is the one that brings peace to him. As you hear me reading this following chapter, where Laurie proposes Amy, you can see how he is very indecisive and his mood changes from 1 to 100 very fast. Jo in the book also has mood changes when she was younger, and when Laurie starts to harass Jo, and they are in their early 20s at that point, Mommy says to Jo that she doesn't think that Jo and Laurie are a good match because they are so similar. And that's when Jo travels to New York because Laurie was harassing her and she doesn't want to be around him. And for some unexplainable reason, Little Woman films between 1933 and 2019, Jo goes to New York after Laurie has proposed her, but in the book proposal happens when Jo has returned and she has started to fall for Friedrich, and even defends him when Laurie proposes, and he's bad-mouthing Friedrich. And that's not in any Little Woman movies. And what I've heard from Jo and Laurie shippers who only watch the films, they expect Joe to come back and say yes to Laurie. But that was not the reason she went to New York. She went to New York because Laurie made her feel uncomfortable. And he's very demanding in the book when he proposes, very aggressive. So it's very different to 1994 and 2019 films. My personal favorite is the 1933 film, where Laurie is very demanding when he proposes, and that is a lot closer to the novel. And Laurie is not a bad person in the novel, it just goes to show that he had a very different relationship with Joe than with Amy. He and Joe made pranks, they were more like brothers, but Joe also had very maternal relationship to him, and few listeners have told me that they had experiences of dating somebody and being in this group of boys where women wanted to be like the guys, so they are accepted by them. And because there was some misogyny among those boys and even the girls in these groups, these women, they tried to hide their feminine side and made fun of other girls. And how they would relate to Joe, that she wanted to leave that environment and actually explore her femininity a bit more. And this reminded me of something that one of my friends said. She had been on the town and she saw her ex with his new girlfriend, and the way he was looking at her, my friend said that she had never seen him so happy, and he never was that happy with her. I think that pretty much sums up how Joe and Laurie can't give each other what they need. Joe wants an intellectual connection and somebody who she is very attracted to and who helps her to become a better writer and wants a big family. And that's Fritz. Laurie at first wants Joe so he can stay the same, but what he really needs is somebody who admires him but also tells him when he's not being the best version of himself. A lot of people could actually benefit for seeing Laurie's growth process, how he does manages to change, and a lot of that is thanks to Amy. How many have been in bad relationships and then found another relationship where not only they feel good about the other person, but themselves as well. This is really the missed message in Little Woman. And Greta Gerwig even said that she wanted to portray Little Woman as a way to dismiss romantic love and marriage. First of all, Gerwig herself is married, and second, that doesn't at all align with Louisa May Alcott's views on marriage when she writes that marriage should be taken very seriously and that, quote, tempers and minds should go together in harmony. It is such a terrible misreading of the novel that the 2019 film didn't show Laurie doing any work for Amy, and it just seemed that he moved on Joe to Amy without any reason, and there wasn't any personal growth, and then showing Joe and Friedrich arguing when in the novel Joe and Friedrich don't argue, the narrator mentions that Friedrich had the ability to calm Joe, unlike Laurie who makes Joe feel very agitated. There is also a scene where Joe says to Laurie, and I'm paraphrasing here, Amy's so good for you, we always argue, you two never seem to argue. Then there is my favorite quote from Gerwig, being very sarcastic now. Laurie wants Joe to step into the world of adulthood. Those of you who have not read Little Woman, listen to this chapter that I'm going to read to you next. How on earth can anyone come to the conclusion that Laurie is an adult here and Joe is immature? How is that even possible? Gerwig must have read some imaginary version of Little Woman. It's exactly what Azul said. I really liked the story in Little Woman, but always wondered why Joe wasn't in love with Laurie, especially since they seemed to get along pretty well. I'm surprised that they left many of Laurie's traits out of the films. My pal Jimena, she read Little Woman for the first time after seeing the 2019 film. Then she went reading the book expecting to find those romantic moments between Joe and Laurie that Gerwig had talked about, but there are no romantic scenes between Joe and Laurie in the novel, so it just makes you wonder what is the point of romanticizing Joe and Laurie. An even bigger question, why the filmmakers sabotage these other two great relationships in the novel. It just boggles my mind, but hey, that's why I started this podcast, so we can study and read and love this book and appreciate Amy and Laurie and Joe and Friedrich. This is what Jimena said about 2019 film. Quote, I think one of the ways you can see how this movie doesn't respect character arcs is in the way the actors talked about their roles. Timothée Chalamet had absolutely no idea of Laurie's arc. None. He gets asked a couple of times to imagine who would Laurie be in 2019, and he really didn't know what to answer. He didn't know what brought him and Amy together. All he kept saying was how much Laurie loved Joe. That's it. He didn't even know what he was doing in the last scene. Even when the 2017 series erased Laurie's flaws, the cast still understood that Fritz was the right partner for Joe. They saw it as meeting of the minds. I think that speaks a lot about how Gerwig wrote and directed this movie. She clearly didn't care about Laurie bettering himself and becoming a useful member of society, and we don't see any of that growth in the movie. The first draft of the script had some of it, but then it disappeared. He becomes no more than a love interest to Joe and Amy. He has no meaningful scenes alone where we can see who he is as a person. There's only that little bit before Amy comes hurting, and then when they are having breakfast together. That's like 2 minutes. The rest of his scenes relate to his relationship with either Joe or Amy. He was sold as the OG ally just because he's friends with the girls, and as someone who wanted Joe to step into adulthood with him, there was not much growth to ask of him. He was pretty much set from the beginning. His only problem was which marches to love. Another book with Amy and Laurie storyline is Mary Young's The Heir of Redcliffe, and this book appeared when Louisa May Alcott was 21. It tells about a rich young man called Sir Guy Morville, and he falls in love with his cousin whose name is Amy Edmonstone. Yes, the girl's name is Amy. The connections between Laurie and Guy are very obvious. They are both orphans who live with their grandfather. Maybe someday I will make an episode where I compare Guy and Amy to Laurie and Amy. In Little Women, Joe and Friedrich have the two when they speak to each other so they can feel closer to each other. And Amy and Laurie have the my lady and my lord. Guess what? In The Heir of Redcliffe, Sir Guy calls Amy as my lady and she calls him as her lord. I think there is a lot of evidence that show that Louisa May Alcott very likely planned these marriages already when she was writing part 1, perhaps even earlier, since she had read some of these stories since childhood. There is a reference to the Wide Wide World in part 1 of Little Woman. It is mentioned in one of the early chapters that Joe was reading and crying over the Wide Wide World in the apple tree. So we have 15-year-old Joe March reading a story that has very clear Joe and Friedrich storyline in it. Then in the chapter Lawrence Boy, Joe has been reading The Heir of Redcliffe, which has the Amy and Laurie type of couple. I rest my case. And if you don't believe me, just read Little Woman, it's all there. And just to let you all know, I have started a new Instagram account. It's called Podcasting Little Woman. If you like this podcast, do come and chat with me there as well. And I dedicate this to all of you who would like to see Laurie's growth process in the adaptations as well. This is Small Umbrella in the Rain, Little Woman podcast, Laurie's proposal to Amy, deep analysis. Learning to forget. Amy's lecture did Laurie good, though, of course, he did not own it till long afterward. Men seldom do, for when women are the advisers, the laws of creation don't take the advice till they have persuaded themselves that it is just what they intended to do. Then they act upon it, and if it succeeds, they give the weaker vessel half the credit of it. If it fails, they generously give her the whole. Laurie went back to his grandfather and was so dutifully devoted for several weeks that the old gentleman declared the climate of Nice had improved him wonderfully, and he had better try it again. There was nothing the young gentleman would have liked better, but elephants could not have dragged him back after the scolding he had received. Pride forbid, and whenever the longing grew very strong, he fortified his resolution by repeating the words that had made the deepest impression. I despise you. Go on, go and do something splendid that will make her love you. Laurie turned the matter over in his mind so often that he soon brought himself to confess that he had been selfish and lazy, but sorts of vagaries, till he has lived it down. He felt that his blighted affections were quite dead now. That being done, he felt that he was ready to hide his stricken heart and still where he had musical friends, and fell to work with the firm determination to distinguish himself. But whether the sorrow was too vast to be embodied in music, or music too ethereal to uplift a mortal woe, he soon discovered that the requiem was beyond him, just at present. Thank you so much for listening. Link to the full episode, Laurie's proposal to Amy, deep analysis, is in the description. Take care and make good choices. Bye!